Scotland, 1894. Two children vanished from a Highland village without a trace. The locals whispered of an old legend. Black Annis, the cave-dwelling hag with iron claws who hunted in the mist. When shepherd Angus MacLeod found fresh scratches carved deep into the mountain rock, he knew the stories were true. 6 men climbed to the cave on CREAG DHUBH. Only 2 came back down. This is what they found in the darkness. If you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe now. This is their account. I remember the smell of wet wool and peat smoke more than anything. That particular blend you only get in the Highlands when autumn turns cruel and the mist clings to everything like a shroud. It meant the sheep needed moving down from the high pastures before the first hard frost locked us all in for winter. It meant long days counting heads and longer nights wondering if you'd counted right. In 1894, it meant something else entirely, though we didn't know it yet. The smell became associated with fear, with the particular kind of dread that comes when you realize the old warnings your grandmother whispered weren't just stories to keep children from wandering. My name is Angus MacLeod, and I'd been shepherding these mountains for near 15 years by then. 28 years old, and already my hands were gnarled as old roots from the work, my face weathered dark as saddle leather from the wind. I'd come up from Glasgow as a boy, sent to my uncle's farm after my father died in the shipyards. The city never suited me anyway. Too much noise, too many people pressing close. The Highlands gave you space to breathe, even if that breath came cold enough to freeze your lungs half the year. The village of Auchmor sat in a narrow glen between 2 ridges, maybe 40 souls all told. Stone cottages with slate roofs, a kirk that doubled as the schoolhouse, McTavish's store where we bought our salt and sugar and tobacco, and the Boar's Head where Finlay Ross served whiskey that could strip paint and mutton stew that could resurrect the dead. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone's business besides. That was the way of it in places like ours, isolated enough that Edinburgh might as well have been on the moon, but tight-knit enough that a stranger got noticed the moment they crossed the ridge. It was young Robbie Campbell who went missing first, though we didn't call it that right away. 8 years old, red-headed and gap-toothed, always underfoot when you were trying to work. His mother Moira said he'd gone to check the snares in the woods on the eastern slope. When he didn't come back by dark, she assumed he'd gotten himself turned around in the mist. Easy enough to do, even for locals. His father took a lamp and went looking, found the snares untouched and no sign of the boy. By morning, half the village was combing those woods. I went with Duncan Kerr, the best tracker in 3 glens, a man who could tell you what a deer had been thinking by the way it placed its hooves. We found Robbie's cap near the old limestone caves up on CREAG DHUBH, the Black Crag. Nothing else? No torn clothing, no blood, no tracks leading away. Duncan crouched there in the bracken for near an hour, his weathered face gone pale as porridge. "Should be tracks," he finally said. His voice had gone quiet, the way men's voices do when they're frightened but don't want to admit it. Ground soft from the rain. Should be tracks from him, tracks from whatever took him. Maybe he climbed into the cave, I suggested, though I didn't believe it. Could have fallen, hit his head. Duncan shook his head slowly. He pointed at the cave mouth, a dark slash in the limestone about 20 feet up the rock face. Look at the brambles there, at the entrance. Not broken, not bent. Nothing's gone through there in weeks. We went back down and told the searchers. The minister, Reverend McPherson, wanted to organize a proper expedition into the caves, but Duncan pulled me aside. "I've seen marks up there," he said, keeping his voice low. "Around the cave. Scratches in the rock. From what?" He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes flicking toward the other villagers before coming back. My gran used to tell stories about the Gleistig, about the bean nye. Said there were things in these mountains older than the stones themselves. He paused. She had another name too. Black Annis. Said she lived in the caves and ate children. I'd heard the stories too, everyone had. The blue-faced hag with iron claws who scraped out caves with her bare hands and tanned human hides. Children's tales meant to keep them from playing near cliff faces and dark holes. I'd never given them more thought than that. Duncan, the boy's lost and scared somewhere. Maybe hurt. We can't waste time on fairy stories. But he grabbed my arm, his grip hard enough to hurt. Those scratches in the rock, Angus, they're deep, cut right through limestone, and they're fresh. The search went on for 3 days. We found nothing. Moira Campbell stopped eating, stopped speaking. She just sat in her cottage staring at the eastern window, waiting for a red-headed boy who wasn't coming home. The village tried to move on. What else could we do? Life in the Highlands doesn't pause for grief. The sheep still needed tending, the peats still needed cutting. Winter still came whether you were ready or not. But then, the Murray girl vanished. 10 years old, Margaret Murray, clever as a fox and twice as quick. She'd been gathering firewood not 200 yards from her family's cottage. Her father heard her singing one moment, then silence. He found the bundle of sticks she'd been carrying scattered across the path like she'd dropped them in sudden flight. That's when Finlay Ross spoke up. Finlay was near 60, had lived in Auchmor his whole life, longer than anyone except old Mrs. Macduff, who was probably ancient when Rome fell. He gathered us in the Boar's Head that night, every man in the village, and some of the women too, though Reverend Macpherson frowned at that. The peat fire burned in the hearth, and Finlay poured whiskey with a shaking hand. My father's father saw her, he said without preamble. In 1812, during the year of the bad harvest. 3 children went missing that autumn. They found bones in the caves on CREAG. Small bones, child-sized, picked clean. That's enough, Reverend Macpherson snapped. We'll not frighten people with superstitious nonsense. But Finlay ignored him. They organized a hunt. 20 men with torches and firearms. They went into those caves. He took a long drink. 12 came back out. They wouldn't speak of what they'd seen. My grandfather was one of them, and he never went within a mile of that crag again. But he told my father one thing, made him promise to remember it. He said, she's real. Black Annis is real. And she's hungry in the autumn. The room had gone silent except for the crackle of the fire. Outside, the wind howled through the glen, and somewhere in the darkness, the sheep were calling to each other, their voices thin and frightened. Duncan Kerr stood up. I'm going up there tomorrow, to the caves, with rifle and rope and lamp oil. Anyone who wants to call me a fool can do it to my face now, and I'll thank you for it. But I'm going. I should have stayed silent. I should have thought of my uncle's farm, of the spring lambing season, of all the practical reasons to let other men chase shadows. But I thought of Robbie Campbell's cap lying in the bracken, of Margaret Murray's scattered firewood, of the way Duncan's voice had gone quiet when he said there should have been tracks. I'll go with you, I heard myself say. By the time the meeting broke up, 6 of us had volunteered. Duncan, myself, Finlay Ross despite his age, young Thomas Grant, who was trying to prove something to his father, and 2 brothers named Ian and Malcolm Scott, who worked the quarry and feared nothing they could hit with a sledgehammer. Reverend McPherson called us fools and sinners, told us we were feeding panic with superstition. But I saw the fear in his eyes too. He knew what we all knew, what we'd been trying not to say out loud. Something was hunting in our mountains. Something that took children and left no trace. Something that lived in the darkness of CREAG and had been there, waiting and hungry, longer than anyone could remember. We made our plans for dawn. None of us slept that night. The morning came gray and cold, with mist thick enough to chew. We met outside McTavish's store just as the first pale light was bleeding into the eastern sky. Duncan had brought rope. Good hemp rope, the kind that held ships to dock. And we each carried oil lamps, though in that fog they barely pushed back the darkness more than a few feet. The Scott brothers brought their quarry hammers. Thomas Grant had his father's old military rifle, powder horn slung across his chest. I'd borrowed a shotgun from my uncle, loaded with heavy shot meant for boar. Finlay carried nothing but a dirk, the kind Highland men had carried for centuries. He said if we got close enough to use it, firearms wouldn't matter anyway. The path up to CREAG wasn't really a path at all. Just a sheep track that wound through heather and gorse, over tumbled stones slick with moss. The higher we climbed, the thicker the mist became, until we were walking through a gray world where a sound came muffled and strange. Our boots crunched on frost-stiff grass, our breath plumed white. Behind us, the village disappeared completely, swallowed by the fog as though it had never existed. My gran used to say the mist was her cloak, Finlay said, his voice carrying oddly in the deadened air. That black anise wore the fog like other women wore shawls, made it easier to take what she wanted without being seen. Your gran said a lot of things, Malcolm Scott muttered, but there was no conviction in his voice. We'd all heard the stories growing up. Most of us had dismissed them the way you dismiss all childhood fears when you become a man and realize the world has enough real terrors without inventing new ones. But climbing that mountain in the mist, with 2 children already gone and no rational explanation for their disappearance, those old stories came creeping back with new weight. Duncan stopped suddenly, holding up his fist. We froze. He was staring at the ground, his weathered face gone pale. "Here," he said quietly. "Look here." We gathered around where he pointed. There in the soft earth between stones, clear as daylight despite the fog, were marks. Not footprints exactly, something stranger. Long gouges in the ground, 4 of them parallel, each about as wide as my thumb. They were deep, carved right through the turf to the rock beneath, and they were spaced wrong for any animal I knew. Too wide for a cat, too narrow for a bear. Not that there'd been bears in Scotland for 200 years. "Claws," Thomas Grant whispered. The word seemed to echo despite the muffling fog. Duncan nodded slowly. He knelt down, placing his hand next to the marks. His whole hand fit in the space between just 2 of them. Whatever made these walks on 2 legs? See how they're grouped? 4 gouges, then a space, then 4 more. That's a stride, a walking stride. "Could be old," Ian Scott said hopefully. "Could be from weeks ago." But Duncan was already shaking his head. He touched the edge of one gouge where the earth had been torn. Soil's still damp in the cuts. These were made recently, within hours. We stood there in the gray morning, 6 grown men with weapons and rope, and I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a boy afraid of the dark. That primitive, hindbrained certainty that something was watching us, that we were being weighed and measured by eyes we couldn't see. "We keep going," Duncan said. but his voice had changed. It had the flat tone of a man who's already accepted he might not come back down the mountain. The track marks led upward, following the sheep path almost exactly, as though whatever made them knew the easiest route through the rocks. We found more as we climbed, scratches on stones where something had dragged those terrible claws for balance, a tuft of wool caught on a thorn bush that had been torn free rather than plucked, and once pressed into a patch of mud, something that might have been a handprint if hands came with fingers twice as long as any human's and ended in curved black nails. The cave mouth loomed out of the mist like a wound in the rock face. It was exactly as I remembered from the search days before, a dark slash about 20 feet up, surrounded by brambles and tough mountain grass. But standing here now, with those claw marks leading straight toward it, the cave seemed different, malevolent. The darkness inside looked thick, almost solid, the kind of darkness that pushed back against light rather than yielding to it. "There," Finley said, pointing. Around the cave entrance, carved into the limestone, were more scratches. Hundreds of them, thousands maybe, layered over each other like the walls of a cell where a prisoner had been counting days. Some were old, weathered smooth by rain and wind. Others looked fresh, the exposed stone still pale where the surface had been scraped away. They formed patterns, not random marks, but deliberate gouges that seemed almost like writing. If writing came from a mind that thought in angles and curves no human language had ever used. "She marks her territory," Finley whispered. "Like a beast marks a tree." We rigged the rope to a boulder, and Duncan went up first, his boots finding purchase on the limestone like he'd been born climbing. The rest of us followed, one by one, the rope burning through my palms, even through my gloves. Thomas Grant came last, the rifle strapped across his back, his face set in the expression of someone trying very hard not to think about what he was doing. The cave mouth was wide enough for two men to enter abreast, but only if they stooped. The smell hit us before we'd gone 3 feet inside. A thick, rotten sweet stench like meat gone bad in summer heat. All of us gagged. Malcolm Scott actually turned and retched over the edge, his breakfast spattering on the rocks below. "Jesus Christ," Ian Scott breathed. "What is that?" "Death," Duncan said simply. He'd lit his lamp, and in its guttering light, I could see his face had gone the color of old parchment. "That's the smell of death." We moved deeper. The cave widened after the initial passage, opening into a chamber maybe 30 feet across. Our lamps pushed back the darkness reluctantly, revealing walls that glistened with moisture and something else. Something dark and crusted that could have been mud but wasn't. The floor crunched under our boots. Thomas Grant bent down, holding his lamp low. When he straightened, his hands were shaking so badly, the lamp flame danced. "Bones," he said. "The floor is covered in bones." They were small. That was the worst part. They were all small. Delicate as bird bones, white as chalk where they weren't stained dark with age and other things I didn't want to identify. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, layered so thick in places they formed drifts against the walls. Finger bones, toe bones, the small curved shells of ribs, here and there a skull, empty eye sockets staring at nothing, jaws frozen open and silent eternal screams. "Oh God," Finley said, his voice breaking. "Oh God, they're children. They're all children." The cave went deeper. We could see another passage at the back, leading down into darkness our lamps couldn't penetrate. From somewhere in those depths came a sound, soft, wet, like something large breathing in its sleep. And underneath that, another sound, a kind of clicking, rhythmic and patient, like long nails tapping against stone. "She's here," Duncan whispered. "She's down there, and she knows we're here." We should have run. Every instinct screamed at us to turn and scramble back down that rope, to run for the village and never look back. But we'd come for answers. We'd come because 2 children were missing, and maybe, somewhere in these charnel depths, they were still alive, still waiting for men with courage enough to face the darkness. Duncan started forward. I grabbed his arm. "Wait, we need a plan. We need..." That's when the breathing stopped. In the sudden silence, we heard it clearly. The clicking had become movement. Something was coming up from the depths. Something large moving with terrible purpose through the dark. We could hear it scraping against the stone walls, could hear the click, click, click of claws on rock, could hear something else, a voice, if you could call it that. A sound halfway between words and the cry of a hunting cat, forming syllables in a language that had never been meant for human tongues. Thomas Grant raised the rifle. His hands had steadied, settling into the calm that comes when terror finally breaks and leaves only determination behind. "Light your lamps," he said quietly. "All of them. I want to see what we're killing." The clicking grew louder, closer, and then, at the edge of our lamplight, where the darkness began its absolute reign, something moved. We caught a glimpse, just a flash, just enough to turn the blood to ice water in our veins. A shape that might have been a woman once, if women stood 8 feet tall and bent wrong at every joint, skin the color of a 3-day corpse, arms too long, hanging nearly to the ground, ending in those terrible claws we'd been tracking all morning. And the face. God help us, the face. Blue-black like a bruise, stretched too tight over a skull that was almost human but not quite. Mouth too wide and filled with teeth like rusty nails. Eyes that caught the lamplight and threw it back at us, pale and hungry and utterly mad. "Black Annis," she screamed, and the sound was everything the stories had promised, and worse. The rifle shot was deafening in the enclosed space, the flash of powder lighting up the cave like lightning. Thomas had fired without hesitation, and I saw the creature jerk backward as the ball struck somewhere in its torso. But it didn't fall. It didn't even slow. Instead, it came forward in a scuttling rush that was too fast, impossibly fast, moving on all fours like a spider the size of a man. "Back!" Duncan roared. "Everyone back to the entrance." We scrambled backward, boots sliding on bones that cracked and splintered beneath us. Malcolm Scott swung his hammer as the thing lunged past him, caught it somewhere along those 2 long arms. I heard the impact, heard bone crack, but the creature simply twisted away and kept coming. Its claws scraped the stone floor, throwing sparks in the lamplight, and that horrible keening cry never stopped pouring from its throat. Ian Scott wasn't fast enough. The creature's arm whipped out with a speed that defied the eye, those iron claws catching him across the chest. His shirt opened in 4 neat lines. Blood, black in the lamplight, sprayed across the cave wall. He screamed, a high, terrible sound, and went down hard among the bones. His brother Malcolm roared something wordless and threw himself at the creature, hammer swinging. This time he connected solidly with what passed for its head. The thing's skull snapped sideways with a crack like green wood breaking. And for a moment it staggered, those pale eyes rolling. Malcolm hit it again and again, driving it back toward the deeper darkness. "Ian!" I was at his side, my hands pressing against the wounds. The cuts were deep, deep enough that I could see white ribs gleaming through the torn flesh. His eyes were wide and frightened, his breath coming in wet, bubbling gasps. "Get him up," Duncan commanded. "Thomas, Finley, cover us. Angus, help me with him." We got Ian to his feet, his arms slung over our shoulders, his blood soaking hot through my jacket. Behind us, Malcolm was still attacking, driving the creature back step by step with his hammer. But it wasn't retreating from fear. I could see that now. It was drawing him deeper, leading him away from us, separating him from the group with an intelligence that was somehow more horrifying than the claws or the teeth. "Inonjout." "Malcolm," Duncan shouted. "Malcolm, fall back." But Malcolm Scott was beyond hearing. His brother was dying in our arms, and rage had taken him the way it takes some men, turning them into something single-minded and terrible. He pursued the creature into the darkness, and we heard the sound of his hammer striking again and again, heard the creature's shrieks, heard Malcolm's own voice raised in fury. Then we heard him scream. Not a battle cry this time. A scream of pure terror, suddenly cut short. The sound of the hammer hitting stone, clattering, rolling to a stop. Then silence, broken only by that wet breathing and the soft click, click, click of claws on rock. "We have to go," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, high and tight. "Duncan, we have to go now." Ian was barely conscious, his head lolling against my shoulder. We started backing toward the entrance, Thomas and Finley keeping their weapons pointed at the darkness where Malcolm had disappeared. My lamp had gone out at some point. I didn't remember dropping it. And in the remaining light from the others, the shadows seemed to move independently, to twist and reach like living things. Something dragged across stone in the deep darkness. Something heavy. Something that might have been a body. "Faster," Duncan said. His voice was steady, but I could see his hands shaking on the rope. "Get to the rope. Angus, you go down first with Ian. We'll lower him to you." We reached the cave mouth. The gray daylight outside looked impossibly bright after the darkness within, even filtered through the mist. I could see the rope hanging down the rock face, could see the boulders below, could see freedom just 20 feet away. That's when the creature came for us. It erupted from the deeper passage like something shot from a cannon, moving so fast it seemed to blur. Finley turned, the dirk flashing in his hand. But he was an old man, and it was a young nightmare. The claws took him across the throat. His blood hit the wall in a spray, and he went down without a sound, the dirk falling from nerveless fingers. Thomas fired. The shot took the creature in the shoulder, spinning it around, and I saw it clearly for the first time in full light. The stories hadn't lied. Every horrible detail was true. The blue-black skin stretched tight over inhuman bones, the arms that hung past its knees corded with muscle like steel cable. The hands, if you could call them hands, with fingers too long and jointed too many times, ending in those black iron claws that had carved out this cave over centuries of patient scratching. And the face. God in heaven. The face. A woman's face stretched and twisted into something that made a mockery of humanity. The mouth wide enough to bite a child's head clean off, filled with teeth that looked like they'd been filed to points. But the eyes were the worst. They were human eyes. Mad, starving, ancient beyond measure. But human. Whatever Black Annis had been once, she'd been a woman, and some small part of her remembered it. She looked at us. Really looked, with an intelligence that was somehow more terrible than mindless savagery. And she spoke. The words came out broken and wrong, shaped by a mouth that hadn't spoken human language in longer than I could imagine. But they were words nonetheless. "Mine," she hissed. "The children are mine. Always mine. Given to the mountain, given to the dark. Duncan didn't hesitate. He grabbed the rope and pushed me toward it. "Go, get Ian down and run for the village. Don't stop, don't look back." "Duncan, go." I went. I grabbed the rope one-handed, Ian's weight dragging at my other arm, and started down. Above me, I heard Thomas fire again, heard Duncan shouting something I couldn't make out. The rope burned through my palm, tore the skin, but I didn't feel it. I just kept moving, hand over hand, Ian's blood dripping down on me from above. We hit the ground, and I nearly collapsed under Ian's weight. He was unconscious now, his breathing so shallow I could barely see his chest moving. I looked up. Thomas was starting down the rope, moving fast, his face white as paper. Behind him, in the cave mouth, I could see Duncan. He'd cut the rope. The severed end fell past Thomas, who grabbed desperately for handholds in the rock face. Duncan stood at the cave entrance, his knife in one hand, facing back into the darkness. Facing the creature that was even now emerging behind him, those terrible claws reaching. "Take care of them," he shouted down at us. Tell them she's real. Tell them to stay away from these mountains. Tell them." Black Angus took him from behind. The claws punched through his back and emerged from his chest, dark with blood. Duncan's eyes went wide, his mouth opening in a soundless scream. Then she dragged him backward into the cave, into the darkness, and he was gone. Thomas fell the last 10 feet, hit the ground rolling, and came up running. Together we carried Ian down the mountain, sliding on loose scree, stumbling through the heather, the mist closing around us like a shroud. Behind us, from the cave, came a sound. A howl of triumph, perhaps, or hunger satisfied. Or maybe just the wind through the rocks. I didn't look back to find out. The village saw us coming and met us halfway up the glen. They took Ian from us, though I knew, even as they did, that it was too late. He died before they got him to his cottage, bled out on the path with his wife holding his hand and their 3 children watching with wide, uncomprehending eyes. We told them everything. Every impossible detail, every horrible truth. Reverend McPherson called us liars and madmen, said we'd panicked and turned on each other in the dark. But I saw the fear in his eyes. He knew. They all knew deep down what lived in those mountains. They found Robbie Campbell's body 3 days later, washed up in the burn below CREAG DHUBH. What was left of him? Margaret Murray was never found. Neither were Malcolm Scott or Finlay Ross or Duncan Kerr. A few brave souls went up to the cave, but they only made it as far as the entrance. The rope was gone, taken or destroyed, we never knew. The scratches on the rock were still there, though. Fresh ones, carved deep. A warning, perhaps, or a promise. The village tried to go on. What else could we do? But families with children started leaving, one by one, finding reasons to move to Glasgow or Edinburgh or anywhere that wasn't beneath that black crag. By winter, Auchmor had half the souls it started with. By spring, half again. Now, 30 years later, there's nothing left but ruins and memories and sheep that won't graze within a mile of the place. I left too, eventually. Went back to Glasgow, got work in the yards like my father before me. But I still dream of that cave sometimes. Still see those pale, hungry eyes in the darkness, still hear that voice croaking out words that should never have been spoken by a human throat. Still remember the wet sound of Duncan's last breath as the claws punched through him. They say Black Angus is just a story, a tale to frighten children. The educated men in their universities, they laugh at such superstitions. But I was there. I saw her. I looked into those mad human eyes and understood that some hungers are older than civilization, older than mercy, older than anything we'd recognize as human. And I know she's still there, in her cave on CREAG DHUBH, still scratching her marks into the stone, still waiting for the autumn when hunger drives her down into the glens to take what the mountain provides. The children, always the children. They were hers, she said, given to the mountain, given to the dark. I pray to God she's satisfied with what she took. I pray that 5 men's lives and 2 children's deaths bought peace for whatever time remains. But I don't believe it. Sometimes, late at night when the wind howls the way it howls in the Highlands, I hear her voice in my dreams. Mine, she whispers, always mine. And I wake up screaming,